Welcome, everybody. I'm John Haigh. I'm the director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you here, particularly the day after spring break. I'm never sure how many students are actually going to get back on Monday after spring break. So it's great to see so many people here. Today's title, The New Age of Empires. And we have two speakers with us actually today. Edo Campanella, who's a senior research fellow at the center, is going to present some slides initially based on some articles that he's written on this topic. And then a late addition who was kind enough to join us is Steve Walt, who's a professor here at the Kennedy School and teaches on international relations and extremely well known. I am a little bit both worried and a bit of a beneficiary of sitting between two what I would call realists. One is a political realist and one is an economic realist. And I don't know what that means for me, but we will find, I think, plenty to discuss today. We'll do the typical, we'll start off, Edo will give a few slides, we'll have a conversation among us, and we'll try to open it up and leave some time for questions from the audience. We're going 12 to 1. We'll try to adhere to that. I do think, as I always say at the start of these, food is an incredible incentive. And so it's great so many of you managed to come and get a literal free lunch. So, Edo, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks, John, for the introduction and the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. If you don't mind, I'm going to the podium just because I think it will be easier. In my role, besides being a research fellow here, I work most of my time in the financial industry as an economist. And in that role, I keep hearing institutional investor, corporate executive asking the same question. What type of new global order is emerging? The assumption is that the Pax Americana is over, the global liberal order is over. So the question is, what comes next? And my answer is that we are entering a new age of empires. And as you will see in the next 15, 20 minutes during my presentation, what I will try to do is something not easy. I will try to rationalize what Trump says, and in particular, I will try to rationalize his expansionist claims and actions. And as you will see, in my opinion, there is a logic behind the military operation in Venezuela, behind the attacks against Greenland, Canada, or Cuba, or to some extent also behind the war in Iran. It's not just crazy Trump doing crazy things, to some extent also that, but there is a coherent, logical strategy behind this. And this is what I try to explain to investors, because it's something that has implication on the way the global economy works, financial markets work, and also the international system in general. Trump has been clear about his expansionist claims from the very beginning of his second term. In his inauguration speech, he said that the US will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that expands our territory and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons, including the stars. And then he translated this vision into the national security strategy that was presented last December, where he outlined the idea of a new Monroe Doctrine or Monroe Doctrine. So the question we need to ask ourselves is why empires are coming back. And in order to answer this question, we need to understand what an empire is. And if you look at the very economic essence of an empire, it can be defined as a political structure whose goal is to give exclusive access to resources and territories to the dominant power. Globalization then makes empires redundant, because it gives access to these resources and territories through market mechanisms. So you don't need territorial control when you have globalization. Globalization is now reversing. to some extent. It's more a regional process, and empires are becoming relevant again. So this is the very simple economic logic behind what's happening, at least in my mind, in the world. So why is globalization in crisis? There are many factors. I will focus only on one that I think is relevant for this conversation, that is China. China has benefited the global economy a lot over the last 25 years, but it has also created disruptions in national economies. So there is a pushback against globalization. But what's more important, in my opinion, is the aspiration that China has in terms of geopolitical role. China wants its role of re-emerging power to be recognized and to be formalized in the system. So the US has three options in order to address these Chinese aspirations. The option number one is to remain loyal to the system that the US has built since World War II. That is now actually in crisis. This is what Biden did. Simply, the strategy is ignore what China wants, just keep going with the system as it is. The second option would be a grand bargain with China. It would imply renegotiating the rules of the game. The US would renegotiate them from a position of strength, if it did now. The third option, and this is what Trump is doing, is to repudiate the system. Trump is repudiating the system because in his mind, this system has allowed China to grow richer and more powerful to the detriment of the US. So the strategy is, let's repudiate the system. Let's start from scratch. Let's build a system where America is at the center. It's the idea of make America great again. And it's a big gamble because it might not work, and actually, option two could have been, in the long term, a better option. But let's see how Trump is trying to pursue this strategy. Trump has a clear idea of the type of empire he wants to build. I'm acting more as a psychologist than as an economist because I'm trying to understand what Trump is thinking. But I think there is coherence in all his actions and words. As I said, Trump has a clear idea of the empire he wants to build. I'm not sure if my American friends in the room agree with this, but the US is essentially an imperial nation. It's an imperial nation like Russia, like China. There are few imperial nations in the world. The UK is also an imperial nation, not because of the British Empire, but also the UK itself is a small empire. So Trump, and if you look at this imperial history of the US, there are essentially three ages that can be clearly identified. And I'm not an historian. I feel also a little bit intimidated to have someone like Stephen on stage who certainly knows more than I do on these topics. But for the purpose of this presentation, let's stick to the very essence of this imperial history. So three stages. First stage is the continental consolidation. 19th century. It was driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the idea that the US had to expand its boundaries from east to west. Trump is referring to this era in some of his speeches. He talks about we should pursue our manifest destiny into the star. The same idea of purchasing Greenland is reminiscent of the purchase of Louisiana that took place in this era. Louisiana was a big territory that was splitting the US into two parts. Then there is the second stage that is hemispheric dominance. This era was driven by the Monroe Doctrine that is clearly coming back now with a national security new national security strategy. It's the era also, there are concrete examples, when Roosevelt built the Panama Canal, they give it to Panama, and now Trump is saying, we gave it back, and we are taking it back. So it's interesting to read his speeches where there are clear references to different eras. And then there is the third age. that is the one that is coming to an end now. It's the age of global American empire. We might not always recognize it, but we have been living in an imperial age ourselves. This age was driven by economic integration, democratization. It was an ambitious project, very costly. And we see also fiscally, it's very demanding. Trump, it was built not on unilateral expansion like the other two ages. It was built on multilateralism. It was driven by the elites. And Trump is against that model. He says, our elites badly miscalculated American willingness to shoulder forever global burden. A few weeks ago, the US withdrew from 66 international organizations that were considered to be wasteful and useless. So he's clearly repudiating this system. So what type of empire is Trump trying to build? He's trying to build a semi-colonial, extractive, predatory empire. And I didn't choose these words by chance. And this new empire is built on three pillars. The first one is selective imperial control. This empire is not as global as it was the one that is coming to an end now, but it is not as regional as it was the hemispheric empire. This is the fourth stage of the imperial history of the US. It's important to emphasize something. When people think about Make America Great Again, they think that this ideology is consistent with an inward-looking, isolationist foreign policy. But that's not true, in my opinion, because if you want to reindustrialize the country, you need to have access to resources that are unevenly distributed across the world. And so you need to have a control of these resources, because otherwise the entire idea of reindustrializing the country doesn't work. So there is consistency, you see? It's not so apparent, but if you scratch the surface, you can find it. No ideology, just business. I grew up with the idea that the US was a benevolent hegemon that wanted to spread democracy, free markets, liberal values across the world. That's no longer the case. What matters now is just business, not ideology. I give you a couple of examples. Venezuela. There was a leadership change, not regime change. Trump was interested in keeping the Venezuelan economy going to create opportunities for American energy companies. Taiwan, it remains relevant for the US until it is so central to the semiconductor industry. No, the Trump administration doesn't care about democracy in Taiwan. It's interesting, last week, there was an article in the New York Times where they said that the Trump administration is conditioning HIV/AIDS to Zambia only if Zambia give access to America to its own natural resources. So it's very transactional. And then I'm not sure whether Steve and John agree on this. In this system, and I have then 3 more minutes and then I'm done. I'm not sure whether in this system, in this model, there are no spheres of influence, only American interests. People interpreted the national security strategy as a document that was splitting the world between China, the US, and Russia. That's not true, in my opinion. The US is not giving a free pass to China in the Indo-Pacific. It's not giving a free pass to Russia in Europe. It wants Europe to become more responsible of its own security. And it will certainly reduce commitments in regions of the world that are not considered to be strategically relevant, but it's not splitting the world between them. So it's not giving free access to Taiwan, to China, because, as I said, Taiwan remains relevant. So what are the implications of this system from a more macroeconomic point of view? if you want to have exclusive access to resources, you no longer rely on free markets. So we are seeing the end of a neoliberalist era that is giving way to neo-mercantilism. We are abandoning Adam Smith and David Ricard in favor of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. This is a system where there are no rules, but it's not messy and chaotic because there are principles. And the first principle, as I said, there are no rules, only national interest. So the WTO in this environment is dead. And I see there is also Robert Lawrence in the audience. So I'm curious then to hear whether he agrees or not. Principle number 2, exchange is no longer based on comparative advantages, but on discrimination. You discriminate among allies, among rivals, and so on and so forth. The third principle is trade is seen as a zero-sum game. The old neo-mercantilists believed that you had always to run trade surpluses. Okay, trade deficits are seen as form of weaknesses. The last two principles are the most interesting, in my opinion. The fourth one is that refers to the fact that the political and economic powers are merging in an unprecedented way. You have the federal government that is taking stakes into private companies like Intel, in companies related to critical minerals. You have the government creating business opportunity for American companies in Venezuela, for example, but also all the trade deals that were negotiated after Liberation Day created a lot of opportunity, for example, for Boeing. It's bidirectional. Also, American companies like tech companies have to pledge billions of dollars of investment in the US in order to honor this reindustrialization agenda of the Trump administration. And then there is a focus on the supply side of the economy that becomes more important than the demand side, because supply is seen as a sign of strength, okay? I will skip the part of the market implication, but I'm happy to discuss them because I want to allow also John and Stephen to step in. And I will conclude with this slide on what are the implications for the world. Well, for China, this is an important wake-up call. China didn't always play by the rules of the global liberal order, but it followed the playbook of that system. It tried to increase its influence through engagement, okay, through economic engagement. And now its global ambition have to be scaled down. China is fine with this emergence of neo-mercantilism. We started the century believing that China would have become more American. Now we have also actually America that is becoming more Chinese. So for this, China can adapt easily. But the question also for the audience here, will China become then more aggressive? Because China has invested billions of dollars, for example, in Latin America. Now, because of the new Monroe Doctrine, the US is pushing it away from the region. So will China try to become more assertive and aggressive? Europe is in a very ugly position. I come from Italy, as you can easily tell from my accent, I guess. And Europe had the aspiration of being a global regulatory superpower. But being an empire of rules in a world where nobody's following rules is not really a good strategic choice. For Europe, the challenge is also the fact that we have very strict rules on how active the government can be in the economy. We struggle to adapt to Biden's industrial policy that were quite orthodox, but now Trump is pushing industrial policy to the next level. So will China become the periphery of the American empire? So that's, I think, the question. Then in a system where the hegemon, that is maybe fading, but still the hegemon, is no longer willing to share sovereignty, globalization will change nature. And we are moving to a more multipolar form of globalization, where that is based on flexible alliances, variable geometry, but it's more chaotic because today I'm siding with you, tomorrow I'm siding with another one. It's difficult, more unpredictable as a system. And then the big question: what happens when the Trump presidency come to an end? Will this system outlast Trump, or it's just a parenthesis, ugly as it can be? So, John, maybe I would stop here and we can start the conversation.
Terrific. All right, there are about 1 million questions that I'm sure people have on some of this material. I'll let Steve offer up any thoughts he wants to, or I'll jump, but go ahead.
Yeah, let me go first, and then so there's lots to like in this presentation, and I've read some of the papers or newsletters you put out that are also really provocative and interesting and smart. So I'll just offer some counterpoint to some of this. First of all, the question of empires being an economic enterprise, first and foremost, I'd question a little bit. If you look at the history of empires, I think many of them emerged for some combination of economic and security motives. The motivation behind the Monroe Doctrine was not primarily allowing the United States to economically exploit either North America or the rest of the Western Hemisphere. It was primarily designed to make the United States more secure by excluding other great powers from the Western Hemisphere. It was driven more by a security motive. The other point I'd make just with respect to empires is empires are economically inefficient. And there's a large debate in the historical literature over whether some of the great multinational empires even made money. That is to say, were they a net benefit to Great Britain if you add all the costs of actually maintaining the empire against the putative economic benefits as well. And that's especially true, and this is relevant for today, as nationalism spread throughout these empires and made the costs of imperial control go up. Nationalism has not disappeared, so if you're trying to run a predatory or essentially coercive empire, you're going to run up against that time and time again. And I may come back to that when I mention the war in Iran. Second, the argument here is that the rules-based order is falling apart and it's going to be a world without rules. This cannot exist. As long as countries are dealing with each other, they're going to need rules. You're not going to be able to move money across borders without some rules. You're not going to be able to trade without some set of rules. Those rules may be different than the ones we've been operating in. You're not going to be able to fly airplanes from one country to another without rules to regulate air traffic control. You're not going to be able to have digital standards that allow devices to work in different countries without some rules here. So it's going to continue to be a rules-based order. It's just a question of who gets to write those rules and what those rules are going to be going forward. Third, I entirely agree that the United States under Trump is acting like a predator. And I have an article in Foreign Affairs that lays this out in some detail if any of you are interested. And the key difference here is the United States is acting like a predator, not just towards its adversaries, which is what all great powers do, but it's acting like a predator towards its allies as well. And effectively, it's exploiting the leverage that it has built up over 80 years or so. Trade dependencies that some countries have, control of the SWIFT system, a whole variety of tools that gives the United States an enormous ability to extract concessions from everyone on a sort of zero-sum basis. The question you want to ask, though, is how long can the United States get away with that? And you're already seeing pretty active efforts by close American allies to try and diversify their economic ties so they are less vulnerable going forward. You're seeing some political leaders, Mark Carney in Canada, Lula in Brazil, becoming more popular the more they stand up to the United States, again, taking advantage of nationalism as well. Moreover, if the United States continues to sort of say, what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable, and the deal we reached last year is now null and void, other states will start making other arrangements because they simply can't trust the United States to abide by any agreement that they might reach. So think about the situation with Iran today. right? How do you convince Iran that we really mean it if we tried to reach a ceasefire with them and we won't just start the war again in 6 months, which gives Iran more of an incentive to demonstrate the ability to inflict pain upon the United States so that they have a deterrent relationship with us because they don't really trust us, et cetera. And you could multiply that in lots of other ways. Finally, how does the United States convince countries in, say, Latin America to sever their economic ties with China, which are economically beneficial, without offering some sort of compensation of equal value, right? Which is something we're not doing anymore because we're not really in the foreign aid and development business, right? What the United States is promising to do in the national security strategy is take over economic responsibility for all of Latin America. If you think about it, if we tell these countries not to trade with China, not to allow Chinese investment, we are essentially saying we're responsible for your economic health. If your economies tank as a result, it's our fault. I don't think this is likely to work. And this is implicit in everything I've said, this is my last point. I think that you've done a brilliant job of providing coherence to the Trump administration's grand strategy. I think that may exaggerate the amount of real coherence that's there. It seems to me contradictory to say, on the one hand, we want our allies to spend a lot more on defense, and at the same time, we want to impose tariffs on them that will damage their economies in a variety of ways. This strikes me as fundamentally contradictory. It seems to me that attacking Iran in the way we went about doing this has signaled an enormous disregard for the rest of the world, and has put us in this very odd position, as most of you have probably noticed, where we are now lifting sanctions on the export of Iranian oil at the same moment that we are at war with Iran. This is a really remarkable strategic achievement there as well. And thirdly, in terms of coherence, if you're in the modern world, it's not necessarily territorial control over resources relevant for smokestack industries. The more important sources of power are going to be knowledge, control of the technological frontier, and how it is a coherent grand strategy to be systematically damaging the knowledge-creating institutions inside the United States, from the National Science Foundation to, one or two universities I might name, strikes me as contradictory as well if you really think you're engaged in a serious geopolitical competition. My last comment here is just to say that what it seems to me the Trump administration is betting on is that the United States is very powerful, and in order to resist it, you need to have a lot of concerted action around the world. They're essentially betting on the fact that the collective action problem will be insurmountable and other countries will be unwilling to organize. The difference, what I think they're missing, is that other countries don't have to completely organize a vast anti-American coalition. They just need to start cooperating a lot less than they have been in the past. The genius of American foreign policy in our heyday was we were very powerful, but for the most part, we exercised that power fairly selectively and generally not towards our allies. Once we start exercising it towards everyone without regard, it will make dealing with China much more attractive, and it will make, let's call them, for lack of a better term, coalitions of the willing designed to insulate the countries from American pressure much more feasible. But that's a guess. I'm not certain that that'll happen. Let me stop there.
Terrific. So, as I said, there are lots of questions that bubble up. I would start with the notion that Steve mentioned as his, I think, second to last point, which was we're all smart academics, and we want to assume or try to impose some kind of rationality onto something that inherently, to me, feels irrational in many dimensions. To try to figure out what Trump is thinking, I think, is just about impossible. To kind of figure out his ability to think of second, third, fourth order effects on any decision, I just don't think he operates that way. And so while there is a rational story that I think Edo has laid out extremely well, I'm not sure you can expect that kind of rationality. And that just creates a huge amount of unpredictability in terms of global stability, geopolitics, and economics. I have a few questions for Edo. I'll start with one. You know, the basic thesis that you approached this with is that empires are fundamentally economic projects, right? And they're economics projects triggered when some kind of market access fails, right? So we had globalization, we had a lot of trade agreements, we had a lot of flows of trade across boundaries, but then for some reason market access fails. And therefore that leads to the creation of empires, right? To try to get those resources. But couldn't the causation work kind of the other way? And Steve kind of alluded to this, but couldn't one argue that potential choices cause the market failures rather than market failures reviving imperial logic, right? So it's really, you're kind of flipping it on its head. It's the political dynamics that then create market failures that then drive empires, as opposed to the other way around. So I'll start with that question, and then I got about 10 more that I
Okay, thanks. Just one reaction to what
Please.
you said, and then I get back to your question. I agree on many of the things that you said. Just one clarification. When I say that this is a world without rules, I don't mean that there are really no rules at all. It's just the fact that these, if there are global rules, they can be easily overridden by the dominant power, in this case, the US, that might simply ignore them. But some basic rules are certainly needed. On tariffs, the way I mean, we know that tariffs have been used for very different reasons and to achieve very different goals by the Trump administration. But one reason that was given, for example, by Miran, the chief economic advisor of the Trump administration, was that they were a way to compensate the US for providing security to, for example, Europe. And if you look at this from an imperial perspective, it reminds me of the Roman Empire and the provinces that had to pay tributes to Rome to get their own security from the core of the empire. So it can be interpreted this way, even if we know that the tariffs were used for a variety of reasons, not only for security. Going back to your question, John, I 100% agree with you that is bi-directional. I don't think it's either or, but it goes in both directions. And the reason why we are experiencing this globalization crisis is primarily also for political reason, because the US is turning its back on Pax Americana that made this globalization possible. So it's a political crisis and an economic crisis at the same time. And probably you are right, the real trigger might be more political in this case.
So let me ask, when you went through the different types of imperial ages, they generally focused on some kind of geographic control and expansion. And the imperial kind of structure you're talking about now is more aligned with what Steve was touching on at the end, in the sense that it's controlling resources that may include physical resources, but it may also include intellectual property, you know, digital rights, and all of those considerations. Is there any historical precedent that you're aware of that would indicate that can be a successful strategy in terms of just this very selective controlling specific nodes and resources rather than territories or populations? And is this going to be able to expand into fuller control, or is it likely to lead to collapse? And I'd ask Steve the same question.
Yeah, so people more prominent than me, like Neil Ferguson, once defined the US an empire in denial, okay? Because basically it was a global empire during the Pax Americana, but didn't have any formal territorial control outside the US, or with very, very few exceptions. So the type of empire that I see shaping up is a combination of that type of empire light empire without formal territorial control as something more traditional, like old-style empires. And to answer your question, it's something I believe unique that has never been tried. And the idea is not to have a formal bureaucratic empire that take control of territories. It's an empire that relies more on local elites, no matter how corrupt they are, like in the case of Venezuela. There is no intention, who knows, maybe with Cuba, to send Rubio to rule Venezuela. Maybe that would be the case for Cuba. I don't know, but the idea is not to have a really formal control of that type. There is no appetite to rule people, foreign people. Ideally, Trump would like Canadians and Greenlanders to spontaneously join the US, not to conquer them. That would be the aspiration, because it's costly to control people. So what's emerging is a type of empire that, in my opinion, did not exist in the past. Very different from the British Empire, for example, that has its own bureaucracy, even if it was very flexible as well. But it's different from the empire that we have experienced so far, that was very informal and didn't really rely on controlling resources or territories the way Trump is trying to do. And you mentioned nodes. For example, the Panama Canal is an important example in this sense, because it's a strategic choke point. We are realizing now how these choke points are important with Hormuz, for example. So, but I think it's pretty unique, and as far as I know, but maybe Stephen knows more than me on this, I don't think there are historical examples that are comparable.
If you go, you have to go way back. Then you could argue that the Chinese tributary system prior to 1500 had elements like that, but I can't think of a modern version that's quite the same. If just can I comment on a couple of points that you made? I mean, the Norwegian historian Gerhard Lundstad once referred to the American empire as an empire by invitation. That lots of countries around the world actually wanted the United States to be involved there because they were more worried about a local security problem of something dangerous next by. We have something like 700 military installations around the world still. So it's not territorial control, but there's a very large American military presence even in this day. And we've used that protection as leverage in the past. I mean, it was a bargaining tool when we were negotiating with Japan over voluntary export controls. And we would sort of subtly hint that, you know, well, we're doing an awful lot to protect you and you maybe ought to make some economic concessions. The difference, I think, is that the Trump administration has done this across the board and frequently and wants to come back and ask more time and time again. And that's actually not going to work. If you keep threatening to withdraw your protection to get a concession and you never actually use the threat, then eventually it's seen as a bluff and it won't work. And if you actually do exercise the threat, then you've lost your leverage and it ceases to work. So there's, I think, a limit how far you can push that as well. Finally, it is worth noting that all of the states that Trump has really gone after, not our trading partners necessarily, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. These are very weak, even Denmark, you know, these are very weak states. He has been very reluctant to tackle a serious adversary, and he clearly misjudged Iran, a country of 93 million people that was, in its own way, well prepared for what came. So that may, again, suggest that the imperial ambitions here are more rhetorical than real if they involve any real costs for the United States. Right? Going after Venezuela and Cuba is easy, comparatively speaking.
So you answered one question that I had, which I think, but I want to just confirm. It seems to me tribute systems historically required, you know, kind of a credible threat of withdrawal of protectionism. And, you know, you implied that maybe there still is an ability for the US to have that credible threat, but they can't exercise it because then they lose leverage. I'm not sure we even have that credible threat. And can you?
Yeah, no. So you see it in a number of places. So the EU negotiated with the Trump administration, and not very good trade deal. And I think they clearly did it in part because they were trying to make sure the United States would continue to provide help for Ukraine, right? So there was a geopolitical desire for American support that led them to not negotiate as hard as they might have otherwise. The difficulty is, the United States was willing to do that up to a point because it still had some interest in backing Ukraine. My only point is you can threaten to leave NATO 1,000,000 times, right? But eventually people stop taking it seriously because you clearly don't want to exercise it. And if you ever do exercise the threat, then a threat to leave NATO is meaningless. So again, there's some leverage, but I don't think it's infinitely repeatable. That's the problem.
All right. In one of your pieces, you said that there are two scenarios, right? You said there's a spheres of influence scenario versus a grand bargain scenario. And in the spheres of influence, you said the fragmentation of the global liberal order could create two blocks, one led by the US in the West and one led by China in the East. So that's a spheres of influence kind of model. And in the grand bargain, you quote, the return of empires is not inevitable. What is needed is a grand bargain among great powers to design a new governance architecture that reflects the shifting economic weights, capabilities of nations, reestablishes trust among countries, and deepens economic openness again. Neither one of those sounds particularly compelling to me as a likely outcome, or even potentially a realistic outcome.
Yeah, so
defend your scenarios, my friend.
So I have to say that I wrote about these two scenarios at the beginning of 2025. So my thinking has evolved a little bit since then, also because the National Security Strategy was published months later, and all this chaos and action took place recently. So probably the first scenario I would not longer call it spheres of influence because it might create confusion. I don't think Trump wants to really split the world in two, but I think these dynamics I discuss can lead to the emergence of two blocks. And these two blocks will, in many situations, overlap because these two blocks might have overlapping interests in many parts of the world, and that's why this system that I describe in my opinion, is not a stable equilibrium, because there is a serious risk that in some places there might be confrontation or clash. So it's probably more appropriate to talk about blocks instead of spheres of influence, because many people might believe that spheres of influence means splitting the world, but it's not a good equilibrium. It's pretty unstable.
Well, and it's certainly not the orientation that Trump is taking at the moment, when you offend all of our allies by various actions. So not exactly creating spheres of influence.
Yeah, exactly.
But this may be a post-Trump kind of model. Okay, got that. So what about the grand bargain?
And let me also conclude that, for example, I'm sure there might be Europeans in the audience as well. For Europe, the real dilemma is whether it will end up being the periphery of one bloc or the other. So at the moment, it's more likely to be the periphery of the US bloc, but who knows in the future? Because in my opinion, the mistake we Europeans are making is to pretend that we are a great power. That we are playing the same game as the US and China. And in my opinion, the only thing worse than not having a strategy is to have a wrong strategy. And if your strategy is based on the idea and the assumption that you are still a great power while you are not, that's really a bad strategy. So better not to have it. And I think von der Leyen, Merz, Macron, and so on and so forth think that not only Europe is a great power, but individually their countries are great power. So it's even worse, probably. And when it comes,
I think you described Europe as an herbivore in a world of carnivores.
Yeah, and that's the reality. And there was a prominent politician, I don't mention the name, at the beginning here for the European conference, who said that Europe should act as an elephant because it's an herbivore, so we don't have to act like the US is doing, but the elephant is big enough to defend itself. That can be a good comparison, but if you tell investors Europe should become an elephant, I don't think it would become more appealing from an investment perspective. Going back to the grand bargain, it's not realistic, but it's the type of aspiration we should have. And probably the challenge that I posed, I was very honest on what I think about Europe, and my challenge to the Americans in the audience is whether they think that the hegemony, not because of Trump, the American hegemony is fading, and this requires a renegotiation of the rules of the game to accept and absorb China as a more relevant power globally. That means giving up influence. Are Americans ready to do that, or do they still consider themselves the hegemon of the system? Because if we agree that the US is no longer the sole power in the world, then probably grand bargain is in everyone's interest.
Steve, I think the gavel turns to you.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I agree that spheres of influence is not likely to work. I think Trump has thought in those terms, though, in part because he's prone to thinking in terms of, strong leaders, that he wants to just do business with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Erdogan, that his model of how to do everything is find the strong leaders, sit in the room, cut a deal, etc. And that would suggest a sort of, well, China can have a sphere, Russia can have a little sphere in Eastern Europe, and we'll have our sphere in the Western Hemisphere, and who cares about the herbivore, which he doesn't like anyway, and would love to see the European Union break apart, because that would allow the United States to deal bilaterally with every individual European country. And a really interesting question to ask is whether or not the United States, if it continues this current course, is actually going to provide the incentive for Europe to unify even more than it has up until now. I think that's a unlikely development, but not impossible. The only other thing I would say about the spheres thing is it won't end the competition. Say if it's just the United States and China, it won't end the competition. And it is contrary to what has been a fundamental principle of American foreign policy for at least a century, which is that we wanted to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere with no other great powers, but we didn't want any other great power to be dominant in its sphere, in its domain, right? Whether it was Germany in World Wars I and II, whether it was Japan in World War II, whether it was the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because if that country was completely secure in its own region, it would be free to wander around the world getting into trouble like we do. Right? Why is the United States able to be intervening in all these places around the world when you can't quite figure out why? It's because we're not worried about protecting the United States of America here at home. We don't have any enemies who are going to attack it. Right? So if China were a dominant power, had a sphere of influence, so the United States is out of Asia and every other country in Asia has more or less accepted Chinese dominance, then China's ability to project power around the world would increase greatly. Now, it might not choose to do that, etc., but Americans for a century have concluded that we're better off having other major powers be worried primarily about their regions. And that means they can't be hegemonic in those regions. And we would therefore work to try and prevent that from happening. And that's the argument for staying in Asia. But it's against the idea that while you're staying in Asia, you want to be extracting as many concessions as possible from Japan, from South Korea, from Australia, from India, etc. If you're a smart realist, you actually want those countries to be economically healthy, trusting in American judgment, seeing the United States as a benevolent power. And that's where I see the contradiction in what the Trump people are actually doing, whatever they think they might have, whatever vision they might have in their heads.
So I'm going to open it up. If you have questions, the microphone is all yours.
Hi, I'm an MPID 1. I'm wondering, what does this mean for the future of American politics? Does this sort of new age of empires end with the Trump presidency, or how would it overshadow the future presidents who would be coming? Because that would indicate the sustainability of this new age of empires. And um, what about the American people? Like, we're talking so much about like what other countries are thinking and other spheres of power, but within America as well, there are people who do not want America to go to war and rather focus within the country. What about that?
So if I may, primarily on the first point, that's a big question, whether the model I describe with all its problems in terms of consistency, actual consistency, but the type of model that I describe, the big question is whether we'll outlast Trump or not. And this depends on the type of president Trump will turn out to be, historically speaking, whether it will be a sort of Reagan, for example, that started an era that is coming to an end now, or whether it is just a president that is presiding a moment of crisis of the past order. In my opinion, but I'm happy to hear also other perspective. In my opinion, the global liberal order is gone. Is gone because it has gone through an existential crisis that started in 2016 with Brexit and the first Trump administration. Biden, who was committed to the system, was not able to revitalize it. It actually contributed to split the world between democracies and autocracies. So, and also with European allies, he adopted very discriminatory trade and industrial policies. So I think that model is gone, and I don't see a coming back. That's why I believe that Trump tried already to disrupt the system in his first presidency, but probably the system was not ripe for a change of that type. He was not ready either. But now, after almost 10 years of this crisis, I think reversing the course is difficult. Whether it will remain along this line or there will be tweaks, that's a possibility. Depends on who comes next, if it is a Republican or a Democratic. But I think there is no going back to the previous system. I see as more realistic this system surviving with tweaks, probably. But
yeah, I would just say that the founding fathers were very clear that they saw being a permanent war basis was a long-term threat to any republic. That once that happens, propaganda becomes constant, censorship gets imposed, dissent gets suppressed, xenophobia runs rampant, etc. I think we've seen exactly that happening to the United States ever since the early 1990s. And it didn't start with Trump, although he is pushing it forward. So if you keep going around the world and fighting lots of wars in lots of places, you end up losing your democracy in some fundamental ways. And I think that's what's happening.
Just real quickly, two things. One, I don't think the American public right now is particularly receptive to foreign wars of any sort, right? And if you look at the polling data, there are very, very few. I mean, the numbers are surprisingly low in support of, for example, what Trump is doing in Iran. So there is this problem for him of long-term stability. The other thing I would point out is that, you know, there's a lot of discussions going on about what does the post-Trump world order look like. Someday he's either not going to be president, he's going to die, something's going to happen, he will not be president. And what does that world look like? And the general view that I'm hearing is that you can't assume the old baseline. You can't assume you can go back to the rules order that existed pre-Trump. And so there's a lot of debate and discussion going on about what that new world order should look like. And we've kind of touched on the elements that come up in those discussions today. But it can't be, you can't assume the old baseline. And I think a lot of discussion goes on about a bigger role, less US hegemony, broader-based middle countries, kind of quote, middle countries having a bigger role. And I think the American public is probably not very receptive to and have certain more isolationist tendencies because of the problems we have here. What's the number one political issue that comes up in polls for American people? Affordability, terminology, right? We've got a massive fiscal deficit, right? So those things are what are attracting the attention of the American people, and they're not very receptive to a war in Iran, for example. Padmashri had her hand up, and then we'll come here and then here.
Robert.
And Robert, did you have your hand up?
Hi,
I want to hear Robert too.
I'm Padmashri Sampath. I'm a senior fellow at the M-RCBG. First of all, great talk. If this was the title of a book, I'd buy it. It's a great title. I just want to push Edoardo's thesis a little bit more. So and I haven't thought a lot about it, so caveat. But from a lay person's perspective, it seems to me that Trump this time is somehow deepening some of the things that he did during his presidency last time. So some of the stage for this was set up in the first Trump presidency. So my question to you would be, John's first comment was, how much of this is really political failure causing market failures leading to future empire building? So my question is, how much of this, if you take it in light of that, can you see it as a much deeper political or ideological conspiracy causing political failures, structural this time, to set up market failures for empire building for the US in the future? Tariffs is a clear case, so tariffs are going to cause higher prices. It's going to be a major market failure for the American people who want affordability, therefore setting the stage with a lot of fake storytelling for future. So that's one question. The second question is, as a fellow European, I keep thinking all the time, if Europe wanted to show its relevance, why wouldn't Europe invest in the global economic order? Because, for instance, the US withdrew from the WHO. China is not going to invest in the WHO. It's clear why. But why won't Europe do it? When the US reduced overseas development assistance, all the European countries also reduced it. It sounds like a really strange and bad strategy.
So quickly on this last point, Europe, in going back to one of Stephen's point at the beginning, I do believe that a world without rules, without institutions, cannot last long. And I agree Europe has a role to play, but it should recognize that it should become a different regulatory power from what it is now. Now it is too bureaucratic. No, but it's not appealing to join a highly bureaucratic European Union at the moment. Europe should try to leverage its ability to produce rules, but in a smart way, so that eventually countries will be willing to follow it, because you need the standards and the rules to interact, because otherwise it's really the jungle. So I see a role for Europe, but Europe should become a different regulatory power from what it has been so far. On the other point, this idea of politics and economics affecting each other. What we are seeing is the result of a long existential crisis. As I said, it's something that started in 2016, but the causes goes back to probably the global financial crisis. That was one factor. Another factor was high inequality levels, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of economic factors that led to the political crisis that is now leading to this economic crisis. So I think these factors reinforce one another. But what's happening now, it's something that started in 2016 politically. Economically, it's something that probably started 10 years earlier, I believe. So it's a long process, and we are in the middle of this major transformation.
Robert, and then we'll keep working through.
Presentation and provocative to get us thinking and I would prefer to think of what you've laid out, Edo, not as a description of what is, but rather of aspirations. That Trump's view of the world is as an aspirational mercantilist. And I think you should do. I hope we don't have the ability to read your last chapter, but what I would love to see is you do to Trump's neo-mercantilist aspirations what David Hume and Adam Smith
Is that all?
did to the mercantilists, whose deeply flawed assumptions rested on deeply flawed logic. And it seems to me that you have put your finger on a lot of stuff that provides some coherence to the way Trump is approaching the world. But I don't know if I found compelling description of the underpinnings, the weakness of its underpinnings, and where we're going to head. So I hope your last chapter does exactly that.
I don't think there's an answer. I think that that's like, yes, I'll think about that.
Yeah, wait for the last chapter, Ben.
Okay. Hi, my name's David Elwood. I'm a member of the Pugwash Council, which brings me to my question. So it sounds like this is the beginning, perhaps, of a great new age of proliferation, because the great equalizer, there's a big difference between the world of today and the world of these previous empires, is that we have nuclear weapons. And, you know, it would be normal, as China may well be doing, to seek parity with the United States now, right? But the United States will need nuclear weapons for both Russia and China. And the great arms race begins. Middle powers will need their own defense. So it looks like this could be the end of this kind of era where we kept the lid on proliferation. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure there are more expert voices at this table than me, but it goes, what you are saying, in the direction of what I think the evolution of this multipolar globalization can go. So we were saying that now we are entering in a stage where small and middle power has been sent to go their own way and to build alliances, flexible alliances, and so on and so forth. Variable geometries. But what you're saying is very relevant in this sense, because this is something that can last only in the short term. In the long term, precisely because I see the risk that you are outlining, countries will have to choose side. Okay, it's not possible for small powers to have a nuclear capability to survive this system. So they will have to choose. And that's why this multipolar globalization that, for example, people like Carney are pushing for, are promoting, it's something that cannot last in the long term. Because, for example, Carney was in Davos, he gave his big speech on variable geometries. After Davos, or before Davos, I don't remember, he proposed to sign deals with China, and the reaction from the US was, okay, we will impose you more tariff. So in the end, even if you try to go your way and you are a small player in the system, a small actor, at the end you will have to choose. And you will be forced to choose. And that's why I see your risk of potentially nuclear weapon playing a stronger role in the future. I'm not sure whether it will lead to proliferation in the sense that also small actors will try to get access, to have their own capability. I see more likely this security dilemma playing out as the globalization dilemma, meaning that you will choose sides eventually. You will not go alone because it will be impossible. But
yeah, let me tell you, so the proliferation thing is certainly a possibility. Although it is interesting that proliferation has never been as rapid as people have worried about in the past. You know, there's the famous John F. Kennedy statement where he says, you know, in the next 10 years, we could easily see 30 or 40 countries getting nuclear weapons. And fortunately, he turned out to be wrong there. So you could imagine a moment where suddenly lots of countries decide to get them, but it hasn't happened yet. That said, the other thing to just bear in mind here is I still believe that the prospect of a new arms race is one of the great national security scams of all time, because the United States need for an additional set of 1,000, 2,000, however many new nuclear weapons is essentially zero. I mean, the United States is effectively deterred and was effectively deterred from attacking North Korea once North Korea had a tiny handful of rather primitive nuclear weapons, because we couldn't be 100% sure that if something happened, they wouldn't find some way to get one of those, say, to Seattle or San Francisco or somewhere. And that was enough. Or they'd be able to get it to Seoul or maybe to Tokyo or something like that. And that was enough. If that's the case for the United States, then this idea that we constantly have to have more just because somebody else is building up is, I think, completely fallacious. But it's worked for 50 years to convince us to spend billions there. Can I ask you? Can I make one other point just about the subject that hasn't been raised here? I just want to mention before we leave, if we're talking about big transformations, we haven't talked at all about demography. Right. And it seems to me, if you're thinking about transformations of the global system, the fact that the global south is, to a first approximation, much younger and poorer, and the global north is, to a first approximation, much, much richer and a lot older and getting older fast, is going to drive an enormous amount of politics over the next 30, 40, 50 years as well. And in a funny way, you could argue this is happening in the United States too. Can a smaller number of very wealthy people run everything? Similarly, can a small number of relatively wealthy countries run a much more populous group of poorer countries in perpetuity? I guess I'm skeptical.
Well, you pose the question, but you don't have okay, so what's your solution, you know?
Well, particularly in an area, and this is consistent, when part of the retreat from globalization is also erecting barriers to immigration, right? And so one of the solutions is a sort of measured movement of populations in various ways, which has all sorts of potentially beneficial effects for both North and South. But only if it's managed politically and happens at a relatively measured pace. But we don't seem to be close to hitting that sweet spot, either in Europe or in the United States.
So we've gone past the witching hour. I think you had a question.
Thank you again. So when you mentioned that China is scaling back like their
ambition,
that type of focus, is that kind of like a pivot from like the Belt and Road Initiative, and like if they're just kind of asking for like America's like, I don't know, like tapping, is that like, are they trying different strategies and seeing which one sticks, or is it just like a pivot in?
Well, I think right now in China, there are a lot of concerns that some of the investment that they made in South America over the last decade might go lost or partly lost. And so I think now China might try to reconsider a little bit its strategy. Since some of these investments have already been made, China might act more aggressive and push. I mean, if the US try to push it back, push it away from Latin America, China might try to push the US away from Latin America. So that might be an area of confrontation, for example. I think also countries participating in the Belt Road Initiative now or in the future might be more cautious, because they don't know whether it is, I mean, the investment remains in theory, and maybe they just change the country that protect them or interfere with them. But I think in a way, this is, if you will, it's a costly, potentially costly repercussion for China of this new strategy that the Trump administration is trying to implement. So there might be a scale back also on that front, in my opinion, because the risk is very high for China to lose money, and also countries might not be so willing to participate in the project in the future.
So you have to kind of think about China the same way we've been talking about the United States, where you look at domestic issues in the United States and how that affects or doesn't affect kind of US foreign policy, right? And in the case of China, they have some significant fiscal problems within China. The property markets have collapsed. They're running increasingly massive deficits. If you look at the United States, I think GDP, GNP, GDP, like 70% of it is from consumption. And in China, it's like 30%. And so they have a very export-driven economy. And so they have to rethink a bit in light of that domestic context, what they can afford overseas and how that plays out. And if you look at things going on with, for example, the World Bank, you know, the World Bank, the IMF, they make loans to countries into the sovereign. And you're seeing a lot of debate about sovereign defaults, right? And so who takes the haircut is a huge issue, right? And so you get China kind of trying to protect what it's done and not want to take the haircuts and trying to force the World Bank or IMF and the opposite, right? So it's a complicated dynamic for China to figure out how to address this with the massive foreign direct investment they have already, and can they continue it in that kind of broader domestic context? Okay, last question, short and quick.
Okay, I don't know if this is super short, but I'm going to try. So taking the economic lens one step further, and granted what you just said about China too, if you, both of you, think about going forward, we talked about like Trump or not Trump and the new world order, but just more strictly economic terms, if you look at the trajectory of the US economy, if you look at Europe, which is still, you know, almost equal size but slower growing, China has serious growth issues potentially going forward. These factors, from maybe a more deterministic sense, how do you think they will maybe be the ultimate influencer of the new world order versus kind of personalities here?
Well, for sure, when it comes to economics, this word is also a way, what I just described is also a way to create new growth opportunities, for example, for the US. It's a way to, in a way, protect the American economy from possible from the mercantilist policies of other countries like China, and so in a way I think China was already adopting this perspective with the new Silk Road was basically meant to create long-term economic opportunities for China and also to increase its global influence. The US is adopting a similar strategy. I think the problem is more for Europe, that is lacking this, the same economic dynamism of China and the US. And I see that for Europe, it's even more difficult to adapt to this model, to this system, because of the heavy colonial legacy that still is present in the political debate in Europe. So the idea of becoming more imperialistic ourselves just to pursue only economic goals is something that would be politically probably unacceptable in many countries. So I see Europe struggling with this system, but I think this model is a response to some of the economic problems you described.
So I'm sorry, we gotta.
Yeah, no, wrap it up.
If you no, go ahead. But
No, I don't have anything to add. I'm not an economist, and I will try and stay in my lane.
So I want to thank everybody for coming. I particularly want to thank Edo and Steve for spending the time. I always learn something when I sit between the two of them, so I enjoyed it quite a bit myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you.